What is propitiation? We see examples of this in the Old Testament and New, but propitiation is defined as the act of appeasing a god. We see in the Old Testament, Elijah with the prophets of Baal, and how they had a challenge to bring fire down from heaven. And the prophets of Baal, when they failed to bring fire from heaven to light the altar, they began to cut themselves and hurt themselves and beat themselves in order to appease their God. We see other examples of this in Jeremiah 32 about the worship of Moloch, and how they would have these statues with their hands brought out, and they would lay their children on the hands of the statues and place fire underneath the hands in this horrific act to try to appease their God. And they did this for many reasons, to have good harvest, to have good health, to have blessings from their gods. And this was propitiation. This is the act of propitiating our God. And we see that brought up again in the New Testament. But what does it mean for us? What does God expect of us for propitiation? We see in 1 John chapter 4, verse 10, "Herein is love, not that we loved God, but that He loved us and gave His Son to be a propitiation for our sins." And that's an amazing thing. We looked at propitiation. It is the act of appeasing a God. And we see that this is a human responsibility. It's our responsibility to appease our God. And we find propitiation and appeasement through that. But God says, while we were sinners, He gave His Son to propitiate for us, to give appeasement for us, to bridge that gap between sin and God for us. And that is the most beautiful thing. We also see many other ways that this word is used in the Bible. In the Old Testament, the word propitiation is used as the mercy seat. The mercy seat that we know to be sitting on the Ark of the Covenant. This mercy seat was a vision of, an example of God being with the people. There in the holiest of holies, God was among the people, and they would go and pray to Him and worship Him there and find appeasement and propitiation for all people. There in this holy place, they had contact with God. And through our propitiation, through God's sacrifice of His Son, we have contact with Him as well. Through His blood, through the prayers that we send, through the worship that we give to God, we are in contact with God. And that is a beautiful blessing. We also see that we find propitiation through the blood of the Lamb, and how the blood that was used to sprinkle upon the instruments in the synagogues and in the temples, and the blood that was given to cleanse and to purify all things. It is through that blood of Christ that we have salvation. And we know from Scriptures that salvation and blood go hand in hand, and there is no separating those two things. And the last thing we see through propitiation is how we have mercy. In the parable of the Pharisee and the publican, we see the Pharisee praying and saying, "I'm glad that I'm not like this publican. I'm glad I'm not a sinner. I'm glad that I don't suffer with these temptations as one such as this." And then we see the publican beating upon his chest, lowering his eyes and saying, "God, be merciful to me, a sinner." This mercy that we see is the same word, propitiation. God, have propitiation, appease, bring appeasement between us so that we can be right together. You and I have mercy. We have grace through the sacrifice of Christ. That is the grace of God. We see it again in Titus 2:11, for the grace of God that bringeth salvation hath appeared unto all men. Jesus Christ, that sacrifice, is the grace and the mercy that we receive. The heathen nations cut themselves. They hurt themselves. They killed their infants in fire in order to propitiate to their God. But God, while we abandoned him, while we hated him, while we were enemies of him, he sent a sacrifice to do what we could not do. He sent his Son to die, to be cut, to be bruised, to be killed for our sins so that we can be propitiated, so that we can appease the wrath of God. God has freely given to you and me this salvation, this way to be made right with him, so that we don't have to hurt ourselves. We don't have to grovel and beg for salvation. We just have to freely accept what God has given to us. That is the love. That is the great mercy and the grace that God has blessed us with, that he has propitiated us and appeased our God for us through the blood of his Son.